There is a curve. It appears 4 times in history. Spain, 1890. Britain, 1914. The Soviet Union, 1989. And today, the curve is identical each time. Military commitments exceed available resources. Currency is debased to pay for it. Debt spirals beyond any realistic repayment. Productive capacity hollows out. Social cohesion fractures. Every single superpower that has ever existed eventually fell. Not one of them stayed on top forever. Not one. That curve is not an accident. It is not a coincidence. It is a mathematical sequence, 7 stages, that operates independently of who holds power, what ideology governs, or what century it occurs in. There is a mathematical law of imperial collapse. Once 5 of its 7 stages have been completed, the outcome is locked in. The United States has completed 5. This is not a political video. There are no sides here. The framework we are about to walk through predates modern democracy by 500 years. Predates capitalism. It predates the United States itself. You cannot vote your way out of a mathematical sequence. You cannot elect your way around it. What you can do, the only rational move, is understand it before stage 6 arrives. Let us begin. Imperial collapse is not what the textbooks describe. The textbooks talk about battles lost, dynasties overthrown, barbarians at the gates. The reality is far quieter and far more terrifying. Imperial collapse is economic. It is financial. It is the slow, grinding, arithmetically inevitable process of an empire spending more than it produces, borrowing more than it can repay, and debasing its currency until the currency means nothing. Imperial collapse doesn't start with invasion or military defeat. It starts with economic exhaustion. This is what makes it invisible to the people living through it. You do not feel the inflation of $12.95 when your grandfather's silver coin has been cut 50% with copper. You feel it as a slow, persistent sense that things cost more than they used to, that your money goes slightly less far than your parents said it did, that something is off but you cannot quite name it. You do not feel the empire losing its productive capacity in real time. You feel it as the mill down the road closing, as the factory in your town shipping its jobs somewhere cheaper, as the trade deficit number that gets reported once a year and nobody seems to do anything about. You do not feel stage 5 social decay as a single dramatic event. You feel it as a creeping suspicion that institutions no longer function, that the system is rigged, that trust is gone, that people are angry all the time and nobody knows exactly why. By the time the collapse is visible, stage 6, stage 7, the people inside it are always shocked. They always say they did not see it coming. They saw every single piece of it. They just did not have the framework to connect the pieces into a pattern. We are going to build that framework right now. The 3 test cases for this model are Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. 3 empires spanning for centuries. 3 different political systems, 3 different geographies, 3 different ideologies. 1 identical mathematical sequence. Spain, at its peak, controlled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Silver from Peru and Bolivia flooded Madrid. Philip II ruled a global network of colonies, trade routes, and military garrisons that stretched from Manila to Mexico City to Milan. The Spanish Armada was the most powerful naval force on Earth. Spain was exceptional. Everyone said so. Britain, at its peak, governed 1/4 of the land surface of the Earth and 1/4 of all human beings alive. The Royal Navy ruled every ocean. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British manufactured goods dominated global trade. Britain was exceptional. Everyone said so. The Soviet Union, at its peak, rivaled the United States in military power, dominated Eastern Europe, maintained 150 countries in various degrees of client-state relationships, launched the first satellite, put the first human in space, and ran a nuclear arsenal sufficient to destroy civilization several times over. The USSR was exceptional. Everyone said so. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. Every empire that walked this path believed it was exceptional. Each was wrong. And today we will look at a 4th empire that has described itself as exceptional since its founding, and walk through, stage by stage, exactly where it sits on the curve. Stage 1. Military overextension. Every empire in this sequence begins its decline not with weakness, but with the full expression of its strength. The overextension phase is, paradoxically, the phase in which the empire looks most powerful. Spain in the 1580s was fighting simultaneously in the Netherlands, France, England, Portugal, the Americas, the Mediterranean, and the Philippines. Philip II maintained armies on 4 continents. The financial cost was staggering. The Spanish crown was spending 2 to 3 times its annual revenue every year. Britain in 1914 governed 450 million subjects across every time zone on Earth. Maintaining order across that empire required a navy, an army, an administrative apparatus, and an intelligence network of almost unimaginable scale. The cost was manageable until it was not. The Great War transformed manageable into existential. The Soviet Union, between 1945 and 1989, maintained 150 satellite relationships and military commitments across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. It fought a decade-long war in Afghanistan that consumed resources, morale, and credibility simultaneously. The empire was spending itself into insolvency one deployment at a time. Now, the United States, 750 military bases across 80 countries. This is not contested. It is publicly documented in the Pentagon's own base structure reports. 750 bases, 80 countries, active military commitments in the Middle East, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Africa, Latin America. Special operations forces deployed in approximately 170 nations simultaneously. The annual cost of this military posture exceeds $800 billion. That is more than the next 10 countries' military budgets combined. That is not strength. That is the definition of overextension. Maintaining commitments you cannot simultaneously fulfill in more places than any single power can realistically project force. Stage 1. Check. Stage 2. Currency debasement. When military commitments outrun revenue, the answer is always the same. You cheapen the money. The Spanish crown began debasing its silver coinage in the 1580s. Pure silver coins became 50% copper, then 75% copper. Then, by the 1640s, some coins were nearly all copper with a thin silver wash that wore off within weeks of entering circulation. Merchants knew. They demanded more coins for the same goods. Prices rose. The debasement was visible in your hands. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. Not because it wanted to, because the weight of its First World War debts made the gold standard mathematically impossible to maintain. The pound floated, found its own level. Its own level was considerably lower than it had been when sterling was backed by gold. The Soviet Union debased its ruble through a different mechanism, state price controls that created a fiction of stability while actual purchasing power eroded through permanent shortages. The official ruble and the black market ruble were different currencies. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it. Now, the United States. Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. The dollar, which had been redeemable in gold at $35 per ounce, became a fiat currency, backed by nothing except confidence in the United States government. Since 1971, the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. Read that again. 98%. The dollar in your wallet today is worth 2 cents of what it was worth in 1971. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury have created over $6 trillion in new money through direct money printing, quantitative easing, stimulus programs, and debt monetization. $6 trillion in 4 years. More dollars created in 4 years than in the preceding 200 years of American history. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. You cannot maintain empire without productive capacity. You cannot debase your currency without consequences. Stage 2. Check. Stage 3. Debt spiral. Once the currency is debased, debt follows. And debt, once it reaches a critical mass, stops being a problem you solve and becomes a condition you manage, until the management itself becomes impossible. Spain declared national bankruptcy 4 times in 40 years. 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607. 4 times. In 40 years. The Fugger banking family, who financed much of Spain's military machine, were left holding debt instruments that Spain simply refused to honor. The modern word for this is default. Spain defaulted 4 times in a generation. Britain's situation was slower and more dignified, which made it easier to miss. Britain borrowed heavily to finance the First World War, then borrowed again to finance the Second. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, $3.75 billion borrowed from the United States, was finally paid off in 2006. 60 years to retire a single war loan. Britain was servicing empire debt for 6 decades after the empire itself was gone. The Soviet Union had no public debt in the Western sense, the state was the bank. But its internal debt, in the form of undeliverable promises to the Soviet population, promises of housing, wages, pensions, consumer goods, constituted a debt spiral in all but name. When the Soviet economy could no longer deliver on those promises in the 1980s, the political system that rested on those promises collapsed with it. Now, the United States. The national debt stands at $36 trillion. 120% of gross domestic product. For every dollar the American economy produces in an entire year, the government owes $1.20. The interest alone on that debt is approaching $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion per year in interest alone. That is now larger than the entire defense budget. Here is the spiral. The United States is running annual deficits of $1.5 to $2 trillion. To pay those deficits, it issues new debt. The new debt carries interest. The interest payments are themselves financed by more new debt. The United States is borrowing money to pay interest on the money it previously borrowed. This is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. It is mathematically self-reinforcing. Each year the debt grows. Each year the interest grows. Each year more new debt must be issued to pay for the old debt's interest. At 120% of GDP and rising, the only historical precedent for escape is either hyperinflation, default, or radical structural reform. No empire in this sequence has ever chosen the third option. Stage 3. Check. Stage 4. Loss of empire and productive capacity. This is where the abstract becomes concrete. This is where the numbers in ledgers become jobs that disappear, factories that close, and national capabilities that vanish, often permanently. Spain's productive capacity collapse played out across 60 years. Portugal broke away in 1640. Then the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern Belgium and the Netherlands, asserted independence after 80 years of war. Spain's silver mines were exhausted or increasingly expensive to work. The Spanish merchant fleet, once dominant, shrank. By 1700, Spain was a regional power. The empire that had terrified Europe and dominated the Americas was a memory. Britain's loss of productive capacity was more sudden and more complete. India gone in 1947. Palestine, Burma, Ceylon, 1947 and 1948. The Middle East one piece at a time through the 1950s. East Africa, West Africa through the 1960s. The Caribbean through the 1970s. Each departure was rationalized as a mature, voluntary transition. Together, they constituted the complete dismantling of the world's largest empire in 30 years. But more important than the territories was the productive base. Britain's manufacturing, textiles, steel, shipbuilding, machine tools had been the engine of imperial wealth. By the 1960s, that engine was being outcompeted by Germany, Japan, and eventually South Korea and Taiwan. By the 1980s, Britain was deindustrializing. By the 1990s, it was primarily a financial services economy. The factories that built the empire were gone. The Soviet Union's productive capacity collapse was its most dramatic element. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 365 days, the Soviet bloc, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany was gone. The Warsaw Pact, which had anchored Soviet power in Europe for 40 years, dissolved in less than a year. The empire lost its outer ring overnight. Then, in 1991, the inner ring, the Soviet republics themselves, voted for independence. 15 republics. Gone. In 900 days from the wall to dissolution. Now, the United States. The United States is not losing territory. It is losing something more fundamental, the productive capacity to sustain itself as a technological and industrial superpower, the manufacturing base that won the Second World War, that built the post-war American century, that produced the goods that backed the dollar's global reserve status. That base has been systematically dismantled over 40 years. Shipped to China, to Mexico, to Vietnam, to Bangladesh. The trade deficit is $800 billion annually. $800 billion. Every year. That is $800 billion of productive capacity that exists in other countries rather than in the United States. The dependence is no longer theoretical. The United States depends on foreign supply chains for the majority of its pharmaceuticals, for the rare earth minerals in its military electronics, for the semiconductors in its weapon systems, for the steel in its bridges and the components in its aircraft. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. Stage 4. Check. Stage 5. Social decay. This is the stage that is hardest to quantify and easiest to observe. It is the stage where the human cost of the preceding 4 stages becomes visible in daily life. In the final decades of the Spanish Empire, Madrid was full of hidalgos, minor nobles, who maintained the outward appearance of status while having no productive function and no actual income. The hidalgo class was a social phenomenon unique to late-period Spain. Men who would rather beg than work, because work was beneath their station, but whose station provided no income. A society built on imperial pride that could no longer afford the reality of that pride. In late-period Britain, the social decay manifested as class paralysis, institutional rigidity, and the peculiar British disease, a term used by economists in the 1960s and 70s to describe Britain's chronic inability to reform its industrial base, its labor relations, or its imperial nostalgia. Britain in 1960 looked and felt like an imperial power. It no longer was one. The gap between self-image and reality was itself a form of social pathology. In the Soviet Union, social decay was systemic. Alcoholism became a public health crisis. Birth rates fell. Trust in official institutions collapsed into universal cynicism. Everyone knew the official statistics were lies. Everyone pretended they did not know. Everyone knew everyone else was pretending. The social contract between the Soviet state and the Soviet people was destroyed before the political contract was. The people stopped believing years before the system stopped functioning. Now, the United States. Trust in institutions, Congress, the Supreme Court, the media, the military, the education system, organized religion, is at or near all-time historical lows across every major polling series. Americans do not trust the systems that govern their lives. That distrust is not irrational. In many cases, it is accurate. Drug overdoses are killing 100,000 Americans every year. 100,000. That is more Americans than die annually in traffic accidents. It is more than died in the entire Vietnam War. Every year, repeating. Homelessness has reached crisis levels in every major American city. Not because of housing costs alone. Because of a combination of housing costs, mental illness, addiction, institutional failure, and social fragmentation that no single policy has been able to address. Fertility has collapsed below replacement rate. Not as a policy choice, as a revealed preference. Young Americans are choosing not to have children at the rates their grandparents did. The reasons are economic, cultural, and social simultaneously. Political dysfunction has become the defining characteristic of the American government. Not one party or one administration, the system. The inability to pass budgets on time, to reform entitlement programs, to address known structural problems, to take uncomfortable actions. This is institutional decay. It is stage 5. Spain lasted longer, but the pattern is the same. The Soviet Union made it to stage 5 before complete collapse. So did Britain. We're on stage 5 of 7. This is where we are right now. Stage 6. Currency and asset liquidation collapse. Stages 1 through 5 are the slow burn. Stage 6 is when the slow burn becomes a visible crisis. This is the stage that the United States has not yet entered. But the conditions for it are locked in. They were locked in the moment stages 1 through 5 were completed. The historical examples are unambiguous. The British pound. When Britain was at the peak of its imperial power in the late 19th century, 1 British pound bought $4.03. $4.03. The pound was not just a currency, it was the global reserve currency. It was the measure of value for international trade. Banks around the world held pounds as their primary reserve asset. The pound was what the dollar is today. By 2023, one British pound bought $1.27. From $4.03 to $1.27 over the span of 100 years. That is the visible result of stages 1 through 5 playing out in a currency. Not a crash. Not a single dramatic day of collapse. A century of slow bleed that represented the revaluation of an empire's claims on the world's resources. The Spanish silver real. By the 1660s, the silver coin that had been the currency of global trade for a century was being rejected by merchants in Spain's own colonies. Merchants in Peru, in Mexico, in the Philippines had learned to weigh coins rather than count them, because the actual silver content was so unpredictable that face value was meaningless. When the merchants in your own colonies no longer trust your money, stage 6 has arrived. The Soviet ruble. In 1989, $1 bought approximately 0.6 Soviet rubles at the official exchange rate. There was also a black market rate of approximately 10 rubles to the dollar, 17 times more rubles per dollar than the official rate. In 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the ruble effectively ceased to function as a store of value. Soviet citizens who could obtain dollars did. Those who could not watched their life savings reduced to worthlessness in months. For the dollar today, the preconditions are fully assembled. Foreign central banks are reducing their dollar holdings. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, the BRICS nations, are actively constructing alternative settlement mechanisms for international trade. The percentage of global trade settled in dollars has been declining for 15 years. Slowly. Then, if history is a guide, suddenly. Once you've completed 1 through 5, the sequence is locked in. The only question is timing. The United States is not in stage 6 today, but it has never been closer. And unlike Britain, whose decline unfolded over a century, or Spain, whose decline took 2 centuries, or the USSR, whose collapse took 900 days, the interconnected, financialized, digitized nature of the modern global economy means that stage 6, when it arrives, will move faster than anything in the historical record. Stage 7. The implosion. The implosion is always surprising to the people living through it. It should not be. By the time stage 7 arrives, the structural collapse has been building for decades. What stage 7 represents is not the beginning of collapse. It is the moment the collapse becomes undeniable. The Soviet Union is the fastest case in the historical record, and therefore the most instructive for understanding what acceleration looks like. November 9, 1989. The Berlin Wall falls. This is not stage 7. This is late stage 5 transitioning to stage 6. The wall falls because the East German government has lost the will to enforce it, which means the social contract between the government and the military has broken down, which means stage 5 is in advanced progression. Over the following 12 months, every Soviet client state in Eastern Europe holds free elections and elects non-communist governments. The Warsaw Pact, 40 years old, dissolves in a single year. This is stage 6, the visible liquidation of empire's most visible asset. December 25, 1991. The Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin. The Soviet Union ceases to exist. 900 days from the fall of the wall to the dissolution of the Union. No invasion. No war. No external military defeat. Pure economic implosion. The Soviet GDP fell by 40% in the decade following dissolution. 40%. The average Russian male life expectancy dropped by 5 years. The ruble lost 95% of its value. In the late 1990s, the Russian government defaulted on its own debt, a stage 7 event playing out in slow motion even after the formal dissolution. Spain's implosion took longer, roughly a century of managed decline from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 to the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1714. But the pattern is the same. Britain's terminal phase, from Suez in 1956 to the IMF bailout in 1976, took 20 years. Still faster than Spain. Still slower than the USSR. The speed is accelerating across history. Each successive empire's stage 7 arrives faster than the last. The reason is interconnection. The more globally integrated the empire, the more rapidly the global system can reprice its claims on that empire's future production. And here is the conclusion that this framework points to unavoidably. Every single superpower that has ever existed eventually fell. Not one of them stayed on top forever. Not one. The United States has completed Stage 1, military overextension, 750 bases, 80 countries. The United States has completed Stage 2, currency debasement, 98% loss of purchasing power since 1971, $6 trillion created since 2020. The United States has completed Stage 3, debt spiral, $36 trillion, 120% of GDP, interest payments exceeding $1 trillion per year. The United States has completed Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, $800 billion annual trade deficit, foreign dependence for medicine, semiconductors, rare earths, steel. The United States has completed Stage 5, social decay, institutional distrust at all-time lows, 100,000 overdose deaths annually, fertility collapse, political dysfunction. 5 of 7. Stages 6 and 7 remain. Stage 6, currency and asset liquidation collapse, has not yet arrived. But the preconditions are fully assembled. The moment Stage 5 was complete, the sequence locked in. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern is mathematical. 3 empires walked this path. 3 empires believed they were different. 3 empires were wrong. The rational response to this